The ferry's engine thrummed a low, monotonous dirge beneath Dean's worn boots, a rhythm that had become intimately familiar over the past few days of travel. He watched the gray wash of the ocean, an unbroken expanse that mirrored the hollow space inside him. His personal tragedy, a wound still raw and weeping, had driven him here, to this edge of the world. He sought not healing, but absence. Absence of memory, absence of pity, absence of the relentless, suffocating weight of everything he'd lost. Solitude, he'd told himself, was the only balm left. The island, when it finally materialized through the persistent shroud of mist, was less a promise of peace and more a stark, craggy assertion of indifference. Jagged rock faces clawed at the churning sky, and a thin, skeletal line of trees shivered in the relentless wind. The ferryman, a man whose face seemed etched by decades of sea spray and silence, pointed with a gnarled finger towards a narrow, dilapidated dock. "That'll be it then, Mr. Dean." The gangplank groaned under his weight, each step a reluctant severance from the last vestiges of the mainland. A battered utility vehicle waited, its paint faded to the color of old rust. The driver, a woman with keen, appraising eyes and a tightly drawn scarf, nodded a curt greeting. She didn't speak, simply loaded his 2 cases into the back and gestured him into the passenger seat. The drive was a jarring affair, the vehicle rattling along a track barely wider than a deer trail. The island's interior was desolate, a sparse tundra of tough, wind-whipped grasses and gnarled, stunted bushes. Dean caught a glimpse, through a brief break in the fog, of a distant, derelict structure. It looked like an old concrete bunker, half swallowed by the encroaching vegetation. He remembered a vague mention in his grandfather's sparse letters of some abandoned work. "What's that?" he asked, pointing. The driver spared it a glance. "Old place. Used to be a research station. Empty for decades." Her tone was clipped, dismissive. They rounded a final, exposed bluff, and the lighthouse keeper's cottage emerged from the swirling mist, a solitary sentinel facing the unforgiving sea. It was smaller than he'd imagined, and far more decayed. Salt-blasted planks formed its exterior, weathered to a pale, ghostly gray. The driver killed the engine, and the sudden silence was profound, broken only by the wail of the wind and the ceaseless crash of waves against the rocks below. "Keys are under the mat," she said, her voice dry as dead leaves. "I'll be back in a month for supplies. If you need anything before then, you're on your own." He didn't wait for a reply, simply turned the vehicle around and rumbled back the way they came, leaving Dean utterly alone. He stood for a long moment, the wind tearing at his coat, the isolation of physical weight pressing down on him. The cottage smelled of disuse, of damp earth and the lingering metallic tang of rust. He found the heavy iron key beneath the frayed mat and pushed open the reluctant door. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the scent of mildew and decaying wood. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating the pervasive neglect. He moved slowly through the small main room, his footsteps echoing unnaturally on the bare floorboards. He ran a hand over the mantelpiece, feeling the grit under his fingertips. Here, he thought, he could finally disappear. He felt a profound weariness settle into his bones, a fatigue that went beyond the journey. It was the weariness of a soul adrift. As he explored, a subtle sound caught his attention. A faint, dragging scrape, like something shifting across the floorboards in an adjacent room. He paused, holding his breath, his head cocked. The sound didn't repeat. It must have been the old house settling, he reasoned, or the wind playing tricks through a loose pane. He continued, checking the small kitchen, then the single bedroom. The bed, a rusty metal frame, was covered in a thick layer of dust. He returned to the main room, a prickle of unease beginning to crawl across his scalp. Just nerves, he told himself, the strain of travel and grief. He knelt by the hearth, intending to clear the ash from the grate. As he reached down, his fingers brushed against a loose floorboard near the edge of the stone. He pressed on it, and it gave slightly, a faint creak escaping. Curiosity, a rare visitor these days, spurred him on. He hooked his fingers under the edge and carefully pried it up. He pulled it out. It was a key, heavy and tarnished brass, unlike any modern key he'd ever seen. Its head was intricately carved, depicting a strange, swirling pattern that seemed almost organic, like waves or perhaps tentacles. He turned it over in his palm, the strange pattern almost seeming to writhe in the failing light. It was a secret, placed here, waiting. And suddenly, the solitude didn't feel quite so absolute. The island, he realized, had its own quiet stories to tell. The air here was different, thick with the brine of the sea and something else. A cold, damp earthiness, like a tomb exhaling. A battered utility vehicle waited. Its paint faded to the color of a bruised plum. Dean tossed his single duffel into the back, the metallic clang echoing too loudly in the sudden quiet. The driver, a gaunt man with eyes the color of sea glass and a beard like tangled kelp, merely grunted, not bothering with introductions. Dean didn't press. He just wanted to be alone, to finally reach the cottage and let the solitude swallow him whole. The drive was a jarring affair, the vehicle rattling over a track that was more suggestion than road. Thorny scrub brushed against the windows, scraping a dry, insistent rhythm. The fog, a relentless presence, pressed in from all sides, reducing the world to a gray, indistinct shroud. Dean found himself leaning forward, peering through the streaked glass, searching for any landmark, any sign of human habitation beyond this lone vehicle. Nothing. Just the endless, muted expanse of rock and mist. Dean thanked the driver, who merely nodded, then turned the vehicle around, its taillights swallowed almost immediately by the swirling vapor. He stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping at his coat, carrying with it the scent of salt and decay. A profound weariness settled over him, not just from the journey, but from the cumulative weight of recent months. This was it, his new beginning, or perhaps his final retreat. The door to the cottage creaked open with a groan that seemed to resonate deep within the old timbers. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of dust, old paper, and something metallic, like rust. He dropped his duffel in the entryway, the sound a dull thud. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was an active quiet, a palpable presence that seemed to absorb any noise he made. He moved through the small living space, his footsteps echoing on the bare floorboards. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, a testament to the years of his grandfather's absence, or perhaps the neglect after his departure. He ran a hand over a wooden table, leaving a clean streak in the grime. His grandfather, a man Dean barely knew, had lived out his last days here. Dean began to unpack, mostly out of a need for routine, for something familiar to ground him. He set out his few books, his worn maps, his surveying tools. He needed to establish a semblance of order in this chaos of memory and neglect. Tucked away on a shelf, beneath a stack of brittle nautical charts, was a leather-bound journal. It was thick, its cover embossed with a faded anchor and clearly water-damaged, its pages swollen and warped. This had to be it. His grandfather's. He pulled it out, the leather cool and surprisingly soft beneath his fingertips. A faint, briny smell clung to it, like sea kelp left to dry in the sun. He opened it carefully, the stiff pages resisting, then giving way with a dry crackle. The handwriting was spidery, precise, yet imbued with an urgency that belied its neatness. His grandfather, a man of few words in life, had evidently poured his soul into these pages. The early entries were mundane enough. Weather observations, supply lists, notes on the lighthouse's upkeep. But as Dean flipped further, the tone shifted. The script grew more erratic, the margins filled with frantic cross-hatchings. Then came the sketches. Crude, yet deeply unsettling, they depicted impossible geometries beneath churning waves, shapes that defied natural order. He tried to rationalize it, of course. His grandfather had been a lonely man, isolated on this rock. Perhaps the solitude had taken its toll, conjuring phantoms from the depths of his own mind. The sea could do that to a person, especially one already prone to melancholy. He closed the journal, placing it carefully on the desk. He needed fresh air. He stepped outside, pulling his coat tighter against the biting wind. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing the vast expanse of the churning sea. But something was wrong. The tide, usually so predictable, seemed to be behaving erratically. And then, as he watched, a wave, impossibly large, surged toward the shore, crashing with a sound that seemed to swallow all other noise, before receding just as quickly, pulling with it a strange, sucking sound, like a vast drain. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, whistling through the crags, or the mournful cries of gulls. But they grew more distinct, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to coil around him, not quite words, but certainly not natural sounds. They were like a chorus of deep, resonant sighs, accompanied by a rhythmic thrumming that vibrated faintly beneath his feet. He shook his head, pressing his palms against his temples. Grief, isolation, the strain of travel. It was all playing tricks on his mind. He was just tired, overwhelmed. He needed answers, or at least a distraction. The journal had mentioned the research station several times in its later, more frantic entries, though never with any context Dean could discern. It was marked on one of the old nautical charts he'd seen inside, a small dot on the island's northern tip, far from the cottage. He considered it a place of science, of logic. Perhaps someone there could explain the odd tidal patterns, or at least provide some mundane explanation for the unsettling sounds. Dean grabbed his compass and a worn map of the island, determined to find a rational explanation, even if it meant venturing deeper into the island's mysteries. He had to. His sanity depended on it. The cold knot in Dean's stomach had not loosened. If anything, it had tightened its grip, cinching around his breath, making each inhalation feel thin and insufficient. He couldn't shake the image of his grandfather's scrawled warnings, the frantic lines that spoke of something beyond the natural world. He had tried to rationalize it then, as he always did, attributing the old man's desperate words to the corrosive loneliness of the island, the salt-laced wind whistling through a mind already frayed. The sea, he knew, could conjure phantoms from the depths of even the most grounded psyche. But the lingering scent of brine, the way the cottage seemed to hum with an unheard vibration, it all felt too real to dismiss as mere delusion. His cartographer's mind, accustomed to mapping the tangible, now craved a different kind of chart, a legend for the unseen. He needed to find an anchor, a historical precedent, anything that could explain the unsettling whispers of the journal. The island, for all its isolation, must have a past. Dean remembered a dilapidated structure he'd glimpsed on his initial survey of the island's northern reaches, tucked away from the main path to the lighthouse. It had been marked on an old, faded chart as a research station, long abandoned, its purpose now obscured by time and encroaching vegetation. He decided to seek it out. Perhaps there, amidst forgotten records, he might find a thread to pull. The journey was a struggle against the elements. The fog, a constant companion on the island, thickened as he ascended the rocky trail, muffling the roar of the surf into a distant groan. The air grew heavy, damp, tasting of salt and decay. When he finally reached the research station, it was even more derelict than he remembered. A squat concrete building, its windows long shattered, gaping like blind eyes. The metal door, rusted solid, took all his strength to pry open, screeching in protest, sending a flock of startled gulls screaming into the gray sky. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of mildew and dust and something else. Something metallic and sharp, like old blood. Water stains patterned the ceiling, and fallen plaster lay scattered across the floor like bone fragments. Desks were overturned, equipment corroded into unrecognizable sculptures, but in a back room, miraculously, a series of metal filing cabinets remained mostly intact. Their drawers groaned open, protesting their long slumber, revealing stacks of brittle papers, maps, and notebooks. Dean worked methodically, his gloved fingers sifting through decades of forgotten data. Most of it was mundane. Tide charts, meteorological observations, geological surveys. But then, tucked away in a drawer marked Local Lore, he found it. A collection of handwritten notes, transcribed interviews with the island's few former inhabitants, and even some crudely drawn sketches. A bargain for protection, for prosperity, at a terrible, unspecified cost. He had been a witness. And now, perhaps, Dean was too. He returned to the cottage as dusk bled into night. The sea mist clinging to his clothes like a shroud. The legends he'd uncovered spun in his mind, weaving themselves into the fabric of his thoughts. Sleep, when it finally came, was not a release. He saw not with his eyes, but with some deeper primal sense. Impossibly vast shapes drifted in the periphery, colossal ancient forms that moved with an unnatural grace, their presence radiating a silent, profound malevolence. He felt himself being pulled, drawn into the impossible black, towards an unseen, gaping maw. Dean woke with a choked gasp, thrashing in the damp sheets. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He swung his legs out of bed, needing to ground himself, to touch something real. That's when he saw it. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from the corners of the room. Not moonlight, not some trick of the eye. Along the baseboards, in the cracks of the stone fireplace, even on the rough wooden floorboards near the threshold, a delicate, almost phosphorescent moss had begun to grow. It pulsed with a soft, otherworldly blue-green light, like embers from a submerged fire. Bioluminescent algae. He knelt, his fingers trembling as he touched a patch near the fireplace. It hadn't been there yesterday. It hadn't been there this morning. This wasn't some benign fungus. This was growing inside his cottage, spreading like an insidious disease. The sea was not just at his doorstep. It was seeping into his walls, manifesting in his living space. The ancient entity, Dean realized with a sickening certainty, was not merely stirring beneath the waves. It was reaching. And it was reaching for him. The cold knot in Dean's stomach had not loosened. He couldn't shake the image of his grandfather's scrawled warnings, the frantic lines that spoke of something beyond the natural world, something that now felt like a palpable weight pressing against the very air in the cottage. He was determined, though. He wouldn't let this place, or whatever lurked beneath it, break him, not like it had broken his grandfather. He had spent the morning trying to impose order on the chaos of the old man's study, a futile exercise that only served to deepen his unease. Every drawer he opened seemed to hold some new relic of desperation. Dried, brittle seaweed tied with coarse twine. Small, smooth stones etched with symbols he couldn't decipher. A rusted iron bell no bigger than his thumb. He cataloged them mentally, a cartographer's instinct to map the unknown, even if the terrain was madness. The first subtle shift happened as he was reaching for a heavy, leather-bound book on a high shelf. A small ceramic mug, one of the grandfather's ubiquitous coffee cups, slid silently across the polished surface of the desk and dropped to the floor, shattering with a sharp crack. Dean froze, his hand still outstretched, fingers brushing the spine of the book. There had been no tremor, no vibration. The desk had been perfectly level. It had simply moved. He stared at the broken shards, a faint metallic tang suddenly sharp in his nostrils, like salt mixed with old iron. His breath hitched, a cold tremor running down his spine. He told himself it was the old house settling, the sea air working its way into the timbers. Later, as he washed his face in the small, chipped basin in the bathroom, the reflection staring back at him was not quite right. He blinked, hard, and the distortion vanished, leaving only his own tired, pale face. He splashed more cold water onto his face, rubbing his eyes until they ached. It was fatigue, he reasoned, the stress playing tricks on his vision. But the image, brief and terrifying, clung to the periphery of his mind. Then came the hum. It began subtly, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate more in his bones than in his ears. It wasn't the wind, nor the groan of the old house. It was a sound that bypassed his auditory canals and went straight to the raw nerve of his apprehension. It grew, not louder, but fuller, filling the space, wrapping around him like an invisible shroud. He could feel it in his teeth, a faint ache behind his eyes. He found himself pacing, his grandfather's journal clutched in his hand. He needed answers, a rational explanation for the irrational things he was experiencing. There, half buried by encroaching sand and rusted beyond recognition, stood a small, prefabricated metal structure. The research station. A shiver ran through him. Equipment lay scattered, rusted and broken. Defunct gauges, a corroded seismograph, coils of cable that had fused into solid masses. He kicked aside a fallen shelf, sending a shower of dust and debris across the grimy floor. And then he saw it. Tucked beneath a collapsed workbench, almost entirely obscured, was a small wooden box. It was crudely carved, bound with more of the coarse twine he'd seen in the cottage, and adorned with the same indecipherable symbols. With trembling fingers, he pried open the lid. A human tooth, yellowed and ancient. A small, intricately carved bone, clearly not human, polished smooth with age. And a single, tarnished silver coin, bent almost in half, its face worn featureless. These weren't warding charms. These were offerings, sacrifices. His grandfather hadn't been trying to keep something out. He'd been trying to appease it. The air in the research station grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and brine. It writhed, elongated, forming a vaguely humanoid shape, taller than any man, its edges indistinct, blurring into the surrounding gloom. It seemed to shimmer, like heat haze over black water, undulating with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Dean's breath hitched, a strangled sound caught in his throat. He couldn't move. It wasn't walking, it was spreading. Just as the amorphous form stretched out, its edges coalescing into something like a grasping limb. A sudden, piercing shriek of metal echoed through the research station. It was the wind, catching a loose sheet of corrugated iron on the roof. A sound so sharp and jarring it momentarily broke the hypnotic spell. Dean gasped, tearing his gaze from the encroaching horror. He didn't look back, not even once. He burst out of the research station, gasping for breath, the taste of salt and fear bitter on his tongue, the hum still resonating deep within his skull. He ran blindly through the gorse and over the rough ground, away from the western edge of the island, away from the place where the deep had almost reached out and claimed him. The rusted, prefabricated shell of the research station sagged against the relentless salt wind, its corrugated metal skin pitted and flaking like an old wound. Dean pushed inside, the door groaning on seized hinges, scraping a line in the packed sand that had drifted across the threshold. Sunlight, muted by a film of grime on the few narrow windows, struggled to illuminate the interior. Tables, overturned and splintered, lay scattered alongside a few rusted metal cabinets. What little equipment remained was beyond recognition, fused into grotesque shapes by corrosion and time. Dean moved cautiously, his boots crunching on fragments of shattered glass and dried detritus. It was latched, but the wood was swollen, the metal clasp rusted through. With a grunt, he pried it open. Inside, Nestled amongst desiccated sponges and sea-worn stones were more journals. Smaller, bound in thick, oil-stained canvas. Unlike his grandfather's primary journal, these seemed like field notes, filled with quick sketches of strange marine life, tide charts, and dense, indecipherable observations. He also found a series of peculiar instruments. A heavy brass-sounding lead, not for depth, but for some other measurement, and a compass whose needle spun wildly, refusing to settle, even when held perfectly still. A shiver traced its way down his spine. He gathered the new journals, tucking them carefully into his satchel. Back in the relative warmth of his grandfather's study, the lamp cast a soft, yellow glow over the scattered pages. Dean laid out the new journals alongside the old, the scent of aged paper and dried salt filling the small room. He began to cross-reference, his cartographer's mind seeking patterns, connections. The primary journal, once an enigma, now began to yield its secrets. The earlier entries, once dismissed as poetic musings, took on a chilling new significance. The deep song his grandfather had written is not merely heard, but felt. It is the resonance of the ancient pact, the breath of the slumbering Leviathan. It wasn't a map of the island, nor a blueprint for the lighthouse. It was a complex array of interlocking symbols, reminiscent of ancient runes, radiating outwards from a central point. Salt from the deepest rock pools, blood given willingly. He swallowed hard. This wasn't observation. This was a ritual. His grandfather hadn't been a passive guardian. He had been an active participant, a high priest in some forgotten, terrible ceremony, dedicated to keeping something dormant. As he read, the subtle hum that had been a constant companion since his arrival on the island began to intensify. It started as a low thrum in his ears, then spread, vibrating through the floorboards, up his chair, into his very bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a physical sensation, a pressure. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortions persisted. Was the air thickening? Or was it his mind? He glanced towards the window, but the fog outside was a solid, impenetrable wall. There was nothing to see, only the pervasive rising sound. This wasn't just outside him. It was inside. The deep song wasn't merely affecting his ears. It was invading his thoughts, blurring the sharp lines of reality. He tried to focus on the journal, but the words swam. The symbols pulsed with a faint internal light. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back with a clatter. His head throbbed, a relentless beat against his temples. But the hum followed him, a relentless drone. It was a siren calling him. Not to the sea, not to the station, but to the lighthouse. The hum was deafening now, a roaring symphony of pressure and sound that threatened to split his skull. He reached the base of the tower, past the generator room, where his grandfather had kept his tools. He knew this area well. He'd explored every inch. Or so he thought. His hand, guided by an instinct that felt both alien and his own, reached out. He ran his fingers along the seam, feeling a slight give, a tiny gap. With a desperate heave, he pushed. A section of the wall, surprisingly light for its apparent mass, swung inward with a low, grinding sound, revealing a narrow, vertical shaft. A rough-hewn ladder, slick with condensation, descended into the black. The hum here was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against his chest, stealing his breath. This was it. The source. The hidden chamber. The crypt. He gripped the cold metal rungs, his knuckles white, and began his descent into the abyssal maw, his mind teetering on the edge of a precipice, reality dissolving into the overwhelming call of the deep. Dean's fingers still tingled from tracing the intricate symbols in the journal. The diagram wasn't a mere sketch. It was a key. He felt it in his gut, a cold, unwavering certainty that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the creeping dread that had become his constant companion. The stone felt solid, unyielding, yet the journal had shown him a hidden truth. He knew he was close. His gaze fixed on a particular section of wall, indistinguishable from the rest. He pressed his palm against it, feeling for any give, any subtle shift. Nothing. He ran his fingers along the mortar lines, searching. Then his thumb snagged on a minute imperfection, a tiny, almost invisible seam. He pushed. He recoiled, a shiver raking his spine. This was it. The entry to the research station. He swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry, and pushed the fear down, replacing it with a grim resolve. The beam pierced a narrow, downward-sloping tunnel carved directly into the bedrock. The walls were rough-hewn, not perfectly smooth like the lighthouse's interior, but gouged and uneven, as if excavated in haste. Dean descended, each step echoing unnervingly. The tunnel opened into a cavernous space, far larger than he'd anticipated. This was no cramped cellar. This was the research station. It was a vast, circular chamber, roughly hewn but clearly purposed. Ancient, corroded equipment lay scattered, half submerged in shallow pools of brackish water that shimmered faintly with an unidentifiable luminescence. Tables, encrusted with rust and unknown mineral deposits, held glass vials that had long since shattered, their contents leaching into the stone. Charts, brittle with age, peeled from the walls, their faded diagrams hinting at astronomical configurations that made no sense, or perhaps too much sense. But it was the center of the chamber that seized his attention, drawing his gaze like a magnet. There, suspended above a swirling vortex of the glowing, brackish water, hung an object that defied description. It was neither stone nor metal, but something in between. A pulsating mass of obsidian black, veined with faint phosphorescent lines that pulsed with an internal rhythmic beat. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a man's head, but its presence filled the entire space, suffocating and vast. It hummed with an almost imperceptible vibration, a deep, resonant tone that resonated not in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. He took a hesitant step closer, the pulsating object drawing him in. The phosphorescent veins flared brighter, then dimmed, mimicking the rhythm of a slow, colossal breath. As he neared, the air around it grew thick and viscous, pressing in on him. Then, it happened. The artifact pulsed with a blinding emerald light, and the research station dissolved around him. He wasn't there anymore. He was everywhere. He felt himself being drawn down too, not physically, but spiritually. His consciousness stretched thin, ripped apart. He saw others, vague, indistinct shapes, human perhaps, caught in the same current, their silent screams echoing in the vast, empty space. He heard a sound then, not with his ears, but deep within his mind. A vast, ancient hunger, a primordial yearning that resonated with the pulsating artifact. It wasn't malevolent in a human sense, but indifferent, a force of nature awakening, reclaiming, subsuming. Its intent was not to destroy, but to incorporate. The vision snapped back, jarringly, to the research station. Dean gasped, stumbling backward, his knees weak. The obsidian artifact still pulsed, its emerald veins glowing. But now he understood. It wasn't just ancient. It was a conduit, a window into something truly vast, something that had slept beneath the waves since before time. Its cosmic nature wasn't about stars, but about scale, about a fundamental, incomprehensible existence that dwarfed all human understanding. The threat wasn't just to him or to the island. It was an inevitability. The certainty solidified into a paralyzing fear as a new, more insidious sensation began to bloom within him. It wasn't just the island's oppressive weight or the chilling whisper of the wind against the cottage panes. It was something inside. "You are mine." He flinched, dropping the journal with a thud that echoed too loudly in the small room. The entity wasn't just observing anymore. It was actively trying to force its way in, to breach the fragile barrier of his mind. Panic flared, hot and sharp, cutting through the icy tendrils. He was trapped. The island was a cage, the ocean a hungry maw, and he, the bait. He couldn't just leave. It was here, now, and it wanted him. His gaze fell on the journal, splayed open on the floor. It was his only hope, a desperate, fragile lifeline in a sea of encroaching madness. He snatched it up, his hands trembling, and began to flip through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning, frantic. He needed something, anything, to stop it. The cryptic script, the unsettling illustrations, the bizarre notations of tides and stellar alignments. They had to contain the answer. He skimmed past pages detailing the cycles of the moon, the strange deep-sea fauna, the history of his grandfather's desperate vigils. Then, a section near the end, marked with a hand-drawn symbol that pulsed with a faint, unsettling energy on the page, caught his attention. It wasn't a description of the entity, but a set of instructions, a diagram of interlocking circles and squares, annotated with a language that looked like a fever dream of Latin and some other more guttural tongue. Most disturbingly, they detailed a final, crucial component. The words were faded, almost erased in places, as if his grandfather had tried to scratch them out, but Dean's desperate eyes pieced them together. A conduit, a life, willingly given to bridge the veil. A terrible sacrifice. He felt the entity's presence surge, a triumphant, mocking wave of consciousness that washed over him, savoring his horror. It knew. It had always known. The solution wasn't just difficult, it was monstrous. He slumped into the chair, the journal clutched against his chest, the terrible words burning into his mind. A life, willingly given. It wasn't just any life. The context, the subtle implications of the surrounding text pointed to something intensely personal, something connected directly to the pact, to the bloodline that had awakened this horror. To him. The implication hung in the air, a suffocating shroud. He was the last of his line, the inheritor of this cursed legacy. The sacrifice wasn't just a life, it was his life. The thought sent a tremor through him. Could he do it? Could he offer himself, or a part of himself, to seal this ancient horror? It wasn't coming from the cottage. It was deeper, more resonant, emanating from somewhere beneath the island itself. The journal mentioned specific locations. One of them, a key point for the ritual, was described as the subterranean chamber of the Elder Studies. Dean knew exactly where that was. His grandfather's old maps had marked it, a forgotten research station built into the island's rocky foundations, a place of forbidden knowledge and deeper secrets. He had avoided it, sensing a palpable wrongness about the place. Now it was calling to him. The thrumming grew louder, more insistent, and the pressure behind his eyes intensified until his vision blurred at the edges. The entity was breaking through. He would face it. He would find the rest of the ritual, and he would make a choice, however terrible. The realization, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, had burrowed deep into Dean's mind. A terrible sacrifice, not a metaphorical one, but a literal annihilating cost. The entity, a vast, malevolent consciousness, had tasted his horror, reveling in the sudden, profound chill that had sunk to his bones. It knew. It had always known the price, the specific agonizing toll. And now, as the island twisted around him, it pressed its advantage. The air itself had grown heavy, thick with the smell of brine and something acrid, metallic, like burnt copper. Outside the reinforced walls of the research station, where Dean had taken refuge, the weather had become a monstrous parody of a storm. Winds shrieked with a sound that was less natural gale and more a chorus of tortured voices, tearing at the few remaining trees, stripping them bare. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass panes, not in drops, but in sheets so dense they blurred the world into a churning gray-green chaos. He watched from a grimy window, the view distorted by the torrent and the pervasive, unnatural fog that swirled beneath the tempest, clinging to the ground like a living shroud. No longer passive ribbons of seaweed, they pulsed with a sluggish, viscous life, thickening into rope-like masses that crawled up the beach, glistening with an unsettling, oily sheen. The very stones of the island seemed to weep, not water, but a black, viscous ichor that seeped from cracks in the granite. Small, scuttling crabs, usually skittish, now moved with a horrifying slowness, their hard shells taking on a sickly, iridescent hue, their eyes glazed and unseeing. The island was transforming, a grotesque reflection of the entity's burgeoning power. Dean clutched the grandfather's journal, its brittle pages spread open on a scarred metal table. The research station, a utilitarian structure of concrete and reinforced steel, was a relic from a forgotten governmental survey, long since abandoned. He had moved his few belongings here, the journal, his maps, a few essentials, seeking the station's robust construction as a temporary shield. But no physical barrier could repel the psychic assault. It was the entity, asserting its presence, a constant, low-frequency pressure on the edge of his perception, threatening to unravel his thoughts. His mind felt like a frayed rope, stretched taut, threatening to snap. He traced the intricate diagram on the journal's final page, a complex arrangement of symbols and archaic script. His grandfather's precise hand had sketched it, each line imbued with a desperate urgency. The counter-ritual. It was all there, laid bare, and with it, the devastating truth of the sacrifice. His grandfather, in his meticulous, fragmented entries, hadn't just described what was needed. He'd confessed his own failure, his inability to pay the price. "The mind must be made fallow," one entry read. "A landscape stripped bare for the seeds of its return to take root." Dean had initially interpreted it as a metaphor for spiritual cleansing. He was wrong. The reveal hit him with the force of a physical blow. The counter-ritual demanded the severing of his connection to his own memories, specifically those tied to his profound grief. Not their erasure, but their isolation. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about disowning. He would become a stranger to his own sorrow, an amputee of the soul. To lose the very fabric of his personal history, the pain that, despite its agony, had shaped him, defined him. It was a terrifying prospect, a self-inflicted lobotomy of the heart. He would no longer be Dean, the cartographer haunted by loss. He would be something else. A groan echoed through the station, the structural steel complaining under the relentless battering of the wind. A distant crash suggested something had given way outside. The entity was pushing, its psychic tendrils probing, testing his resolve. It knew what he was reading. It knew his internal struggle. Dean closed his eyes, pressing his thumbs into his temples, trying to quell the throbbing behind his eyes. He had come to this island seeking solitude, a fresh start. He had found something else entirely. The cost was immense, a personal annihilation. But the alternative was worse. His hands, though trembling, moved with purpose. The air in the research station crackled, the entity's presence a palpable weight, a triumphant roar in the storm. It was ready for him. And so, he realized, was he. The cold, sharp realization of an annihilating cost, a terrible sacrifice, had stripped away any lingering doubt, leaving Dean with a stark, brutal clarity. The entity had tasted his horror, yes, but it had also tasted his resolve. There was no escape, only confrontation. He knew what he needed. A half-forgotten passage in his grandfather's cryptic journals, a crude drawing of a complex sigil, had spoken of a forgotten device, an anchor point, stored in the island's old research station. It was a desperate gamble, but the only one left. The trek to the research station was a blur of wind-whipped fog and the insidious whisper of the sea. The ground beneath his boots felt less like solid earth and more like a spongy, living thing. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic and utterly alien. The research station emerged from the swirling gray like a skeletal ribcage, its corrugated metal walls streaked with rust, windows long since shattered and boarded over. A faint, phosphorescent glow pulsed from within, a sickly green light that seemed to breathe. Dean pushed open the heavy, creaking door, the sound swallowed by the omnipresent hum. His grandfather's notes had described it as a harmonic resonator, designed to focus and amplify the island's latent energies. And it was essential. As Dean reached for it, the humming intensified, reverberating through the floorboards, up his legs, into his chest. He felt a sudden, crushing weight, as if the very air had solidified around him. He squeezed his eyes shut, his breath catching in his throat. Not real. He wrenched the resonator from its stand, its cold metal searing his palms. It was heavier than it looked, imbued with a terrible, dormant power. The path back to the lighthouse was a gauntlet. The ground pitched and rolled beneath his feet, the fog coalescing into shifting forms, indistinct, monstrous shapes that writhed at the periphery of his vision. The thrumming grew to a deafening roar, punctuated by a sound like colossal chains dragging across the ocean floor. He stumbled, his knees nearly giving way, the resonator a dead weight in his arms. Finally, the lighthouse. Its stark white tower, usually a beacon of defiance against the storm, now seemed a fragile, ancient sentinel. The air around it crackled with an unnatural energy, a palpable pressure that made his ears pop. He forced himself up the winding steps, each footfall heavy, labored. The salt-laced air inside was now tinged with that metallic alien scent, stronger than ever. He reached the lantern room, the glass panes rattling in their frames, groaning under an unseen force. The entity was here, fully manifested not as a corporeal form, but as a vast, suffocating presence that filled the space, bending light, distorting sound, pressing down on his very consciousness. Dean planted the resonator in the center of the lantern room, positioning it atop the worn, circular iron plate his grandfather had etched with the same sigil. His hands trembled as he placed the final components. Sea-worn stones, a vial of his own blood, and a dried, blackened piece of parchment from his grandfather's journal detailing the ritual. It offered him a vision of peace, of reunion. If only he would cease. If only he would surrender. But the clarity remained. The terrible sacrifice. It wasn't just the offering of items, not even just the blood. It was a severing. A final, irreversible act of cutting himself off, not just from the entity, but from the echoes of his past, from the very memory that chained him to this island. He had to become a blank slate, an empty vessel, to truly seal the breach. He closed his eyes, forcing a breath past the crushing weight in his chest. He ignited the parchment, its ancient symbols flaring with an unnatural blue flame. The resonator pulsed violently, the crystal at its apex glowing with blinding intensity. The entity shrieked again, a sound of pure agony and rage, its vast presence thrashing against the confines of the room, against the ritual. The lighthouse shuddered violently, stones groaning, the glass panes threatening to shatter. Dean felt a tearing, a rending within him, as if threads of his very being were being ripped away. Memories, faces, the scent of his lost home, the sound of laughter. All of it began to unravel, to dissolve into the overwhelming roar of the entity's protest. He held fast, his hands pressed against the vibrating resonator, his vision blurring, tears streaming down his face. Not from sorrow, but from the sheer annihilating force of the severance. He was emptying himself, becoming nothing, a vessel for the sealing. With a final, gargantuan shudder that nearly threw him from his feet, the light in the resonator flared, a blinding white flash that filled the lantern room. The crushing pressure lifted. The impossible colors vanished. The thrumming died down to a faint, distant echo. Dean stood, swaying, leaning heavily on the cold metal of the resonator. He felt empty. The weight of grief was gone, but so was the memory of its contours. He looked out at the churning sea, at the receding fog, and felt a strange, detached calm. The entity was gone, sealed away. But so too was a part of himself, a part he could never reclaim. The sacrifice was complete, and the cost, he realized, was everything. He understood now. His grandfather's journals, the cryptic markings, the meticulous maintenance of the lighthouse's ancient mechanisms. It wasn't just a warning. It was a manual. He moved through the cottage with a grim purpose, his hands fumbling with the heavy brass key he'd found hidden beneath a loose flagstone by the hearth. It fit the intricate lock on the lighthouse's lowest door, a door he'd never noticed, obscured by decades of salt spray and peeling paint. He climbed the winding stairs, his boots echoing on the worn stone, each step a descent into a deeper, more profound silence. At the very base of the light chamber, beneath the massive, multifaceted lens, a circular indentation marred the stone floor. It was shallow, barely visible, but his fingers traced the faint geometric patterns etched around its rim. This wasn't for light. This was for sound. He remembered a passage from his grandfather's most fragmented journal, a single, terrifying line. The song must be met with a counter-song. It was heavy, far heavier than it looked, and when his fingers brushed its lip, a low, resonant hum seemed to vibrate through his bones, a hum that felt ancient, sorrowful, and terribly powerful. This was the event. This was the instrument of the binding. With a grunt, he positioned the bell carefully within the circular indentation. He looked at the thick, braided rope hanging beside it, a rope that led up into the unseen mechanisms of the light itself. This wasn't about illumination. It was about resonance. He gripped the rope, his knuckles white. It was louder, more insistent than ever, a direct challenge. He pulled. The rope was stiff, resistant, as if fighting him. Muscles screamed, sinews strained. A deep, agonizing groan emanated from the bell, a sound that wasn't merely heard but felt, reverberating through the island, through the sea, through Dean himself. The lighthouse shuddered around him, dust raining from the ceiling, the glass panes of the lantern room rattling violently. The pressure in his head intensified to a splitting agony, and he tasted copper in his mouth. He pulled again, a scream tearing from his own throat, mingling with the bell's mournful peal. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of colliding realities. He felt the entity recoil, a vast wounded intelligence lashing out, its presence momentarily fractured, a terrible psychic shriek piercing his mind. Then, with a final shuddering clang, the sound died. Not faded, but died, as if severed. A profound, almost painful silence descended, heavier than any he had ever known. The deep song was gone. For now. He collapsed against the cold stone wall, gasping, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. His entire body ached, every cell vibrating with residual energy. He felt. As the last echoes of the bell's binding note faded from his perception, he understood his grandfather's legacy. The island wasn't merely a place where the entity dwelt. It was a prison, and the lighthouse, with its terrible bell, was the lock. His grandfather hadn't just been a keeper of the light. He had been a warden, an unwilling guardian. And now, Dean was too. He was bound. The cost was not just his sanity, but his freedom, his future. He was the new warder, the silent sentinel, forever listening for the first stirrings of the deep song, forever prepared to strike the binding note. The entity was neutralized, yes, but he was its new living cage. Days later, or perhaps weeks, time had blurred into an indistinct gray smear. A small, sturdy vessel approached the island. Its occupants, 2 individuals in practical weatherproof gear, were from the research station on the mainland, sent to investigate an unexplained seismic anomaly that had registered days prior. They found Dean not in the cottage, but sitting on the highest rock outcrop, staring out at the turbulent gray sea, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on a horizon they couldn't see. "Are you all right, sir?" asked one, a woman with keen, observant eyes. Her voice was gentle, edged with professional concern. Dean turned his head slowly, his neck stiff, his movements like a marionette's. He looked at them, not at them, but through them, as if they were ghosts. His clothes were ragged, his face gaunt, his beard matted with salt and grime. He didn't answer. He couldn't. How could he explain the binding, the cost, the terrifying knowledge he now carried? The other, a man with a clipboard, approached cautiously. "We detected a significant energy fluctuation from the island. Did you experience anything unusual?" Dean's lips parted, a dry, cracking sound escaping. "And it hungers." The 2 colleagues exchanged a worried glance. The woman knelt beside him, her expression softening. "We should get you back to the research station. Get you some food, some rest." He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. His gaze drifted back to the sea, to the boundless, crushing depths. He felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a promise of awakening. He was the guardian now. He understood the pact. He could not leave. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the war, he knew, was eternal. He was merely a new soldier in an ancient, endless conflict, his mind a shattered vessel holding the terrifying truth of the deep song. He watched the waves, waiting, always waiting.